no acceptance of African Americans who had mental health problems. One of the jokes was, nobody Black goes crazy in Charleston, obviously, because there's no one in the mental health hospitals. Just an array of really troublesome facts that were being ignored. And the women went on strike, attracted the Southern Christian Leadership Council at a time when Ralph Abernathy was trying to step into assassinated Martin Luther King's shoes, and the labor union for hospital workers. With that grouping, I managed to move from the early efforts of civil rights in the 30s and 40s in South Carolina to what is essentially one of the last big movements before Black Power takes hold. And it was my way of collecting the stories of these brave people. And so this is not, I'm not a historian, I identify as a journalist, and while this is probably described often as a history book, it is stories. I am very respectful of people's voices, and I talk to most of the people that are in the book, or at the very least the next generation. So it is their stories in their time period, and I hope that they're honored properly. So what I'm going to do is, I want to mention one other thing. So why me? I'm not from South Carolina, and I'm not African American. I identify as white. I am a good listener. I have an open heart. I believe that stories are transformative, and I could convey that to the people whose stories I asked for. And so I was trusted, and I was referred on often, in terms of, you can talk to her and you can tell your story. And many of the people that I located were not telling their stories, even to their family, because they were so upsetting. There were things that they had packed away and didn't bring out because of the pain that it would cause them sometimes to remember. So these are stories that would not have been on the magazines of the time, like Newsweek or Life or Look, but collected together, they tell how things really happen, because it's not about the great man behind the podium or at the TV camera. It's about all the people who get up in the morning, and no matter what their post in the world is, they say, I'm going to do something today that's going to make the world a better place, even at the risk of my life. And those are the people that I talk to. So I'm going to hit share screen, which Holly has allowed me. And I'm going to go to the archival photos that I have collected for you. And so I'm going to tell their stories and some of the story of the book of Briggs versus Elliott through these photographs. And that will take me about 35 or so minutes. And then I hope we'll have a great conversation, because I do very much want to hear from such wonderful people. So this is the NAACP flag in New York City. It was erected a few years after the NAACP was founded by white and Black people. It hung outside the NAACP headquarters from 1920 to 1938, when there were so many threats about being moved out of the building and not being able to rent anywhere in New York City. The flag was no longer flown, but it was flown every time there was a lynching. Now, the NAACP was collecting lynching statistics. So was Ida B. Wells Barnett, who I'm sure most of you know, and the Tuskegee Institute. And now the Equal Justice Institute, which you may have heard of, and has a wonderful website and a report on lynching, is collecting those numbers and reinvestigating, and has located somewhere close to 6,000 lynchings now, although their website talks about 4,000 in their older report. And they have a beautiful monument to the people who've been lynched, and are continuing to collect the statistics so that we can confront this part of our history more accurately, and maybe with more humility and appreciation of the kind of country that we actually are. So it's very important to understand that a lynching is not just a hanging. It's any sort of extrajudicial, more than a couple of people, choice to kill somebody, to terrorize a community, And so lynching victims were pulled behind horses. They were hanged in sometimes celebratory manners where thousands of people would come. They were sometimes ejected from jails where they may have just been held, not even charged. And in South Carolina, women and children were among the lynching victims. This is Reverend James Hinton. So Reverend Hinton was born in North Carolina in the early 1900s, orphaned and brought up by a relative in New York City. He was one of a few hundred African-American officers in World War I. And he mustered out in Augusta, Georgia, where there was a Black-owned business called Pilgrim Health and Life. And he traveled the East Coast for them and then settled in Augusta and Columbia. Quickly became and by Augusta and Columbia, I mean that he had an office in Augusta and his family in Columbia, quickly became the NAACP president. And look at his eyes. This is one of the reasons I want to use these pictures. Those are fierce eyes, and he was a fierce man. He would say things that everybody else was afraid to say, but he would say them in an accurate and useful way. And he was determined to achieve for African Americans what he called first-class citizenship, which to him meant that you had the vote and you had education. And so that's where his focus was. And so he, when he became the state conference chairman in 1941, he immediately went to work on collecting people to petition for their rights. So the first successful lawsuit he did was in 1943 with the NAACP, and he pulls in Thurgood Marshall because he's so good at what he does. Thurgood Marshall, about this time period, also forms a legal defense and education fund for the NAACP, where the NAACP is now focused on using the courts for rights. And so they win the equal pay lawsuit. And at this point in time, women that are white teachers are making about 10 times what women who are Black are making. After he wins that lawsuit, he goes on to Briggs versus Elliott. He goes on to voting lawsuits. And at this point in time, there was what was called the white primary, meaning only white people could vote in the primary. South Carolina was dominated by the Democratic Party, which is not the Democratic Party of now, but which is more of the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party of then, which, as you probably know, Strom Thurmond disassociated himself from at a certain point. So this Democratic Party, South Carolina was the last state to refuse to outlaw the white primary. There was a Texas lawsuit, Smith versus Allwright. As soon as Hinton saw that, he started putting people outside where voter registration books were. And at this point in time, you could go into a hat store, a grocery store, and someone there might be a voter registration clerk. And if you were Black, they were going to hide the book and refuse to register you. So Reverend Hinton would station Black people, sometimes himself included, outside these locations. And when they saw the book come out, they would look for stores that had the big plate glass windows. They would race over while the book was there to try and register. They did not succeed. So on a certain day in the 40s, George Elmore walked up, who lived in Columbia. He was an entrepreneur. He drove a taxi. He owned a store. He did photography. He was part of the NAACP. And he looked in the descriptions of the time white. And he said, let me go over there. So he went over, the clerk thought he was white, started complaining about the Black men across the street. This is on Hardin Street, which I'm sure you're familiar with if you know Columbia, near Allen and Benedict. And she started lecturing him about if he hadn't registered to vote, he needed to register to vote to stop the Black people from trying to register to vote. She pulls out the book, she explains how to put his name in, he puts his name in, he puts his address in, she looks at the address and she says, you are, and you can insert an offensive word there. Go ahead, invite your friends over. And so 6 Black men get to register to vote on that day because of George Elmore. He sues, he wins because by now the Supreme Court and all the other states agree that it's a basic right to be able to vote in the primary. South Carolina immediately, upon Smith versus Allwright, had repealed, it's called a white supremacy session, and repealed every law that related to voting. And so when they lose this case, they then create a segregation oath. And so if you want to vote, fine, come register. But when you show up to place your vote, you're going to have to sign a segregation oath. So Hinton finds someone to sue again, a man named David Brown in Beaufort. They sue, and this time the judge, whose name is Waring and will be important in Briggs versus Elliott, says, I'm putting you in jail. I'm calling you in contempt and putting you in jail if you violate my orders. He says, South Carolina, it's time to rejoin the Union. And so Black people get a limited right to vote. I'm bringing up some of these things because they build into Briggs versus Elliott, but because also you should recognize that similar things are happening right now. So he also tries, he has a petitioner to try and get into the College of Charleston. They fail at that, but that same petitioner, John Wrighton, sues for a law school after he graduates from SC State. The same judge, Judge Waring, federal judge, says, by this time, there have been several NAACP lawsuits in other states where people have been told that they have a right to go to a law school or an equivalent. So Waring says, USC must open or an equivalent, or I shut USC. So USC assists, as does the legislature, in creating a what Thurgood Marshall and Hinton called a so-called law school at South Carolina State. It had 3 teachers, no books, and 1 room. But out of that come people like Matthew Perry, who became a federal judge, Justice Finney, Supreme Court Justice for South Carolina. So it was a law school that was very effective, but a tempered win. And so this is the man who says at an Allen summer school meeting, find me a preacher, and I'll explain in a second why preacher. Find me a preacher who wants a school bus, because he thinks the way to get into the issue of equalizing schools is to start off with school buses. So white people have rationalized that because they pay most of the taxes, that they should get all the money for the taxes. And so schools at this point in time, and I'll show you some, are just what you would recognize today: brick, water fountains, playgrounds for white people, and their school buses taking white children to school. Black children are living in the rural areas mostly because their parents are sharecroppers and tenant farmers, excuse me, and farmers and service people. They're walking literally in Summerton, South Carolina, where Briggs versus Elliott is going to start, 9 miles to school. I walked it with some kids. It takes a heck of a long time to walk 9 miles to get to school. And so there are no buses for them. And so this is where he wants to start, is with a school bus. So he wins the lawsuit. I'm going to circle his face. There he is voting in Columbia. But South Carolina, as I'm already showing you, will do anything to prevent success. So this is at the end of a voting day. This is in the Waverly area, Allen Benedict area, and you see this long line. These are people who are waiting to vote, and they're going to close the polls so that they can't vote. So they have registered. They're registered voters who expect to vote and use their constitutional rights, and they're going to be thwarted. I have 3 upsetting pictures that I'm going to show you. This is one. They're all related to the violence of the time. This is Isaac Woodard. And so after World War II, you get many veterans who come back into South Carolina, and they have been risking their lives in Asia and in Europe for democracy. And they come back, they can't walk into the front door of a restaurant, they can't try on clothes in stores. They are expected to walk off the sidewalks when a white person comes. They are, as we've already explored, prevented from voting. Isaac Woodard is mustered out of Augusta. He is on a bus going to meet his wife. He has asked the bus driver repeatedly to stop so he can use the restroom. Bus drivers, as you're probably familiar with Rosa Parks, but there were many cases like this in South Carolina too, have police powers, and they could be absolutely the rule in a bus and very, very harsh about it. And when the bus driver won't stop, Isaac Woodard, who is a decorated World War II veteran, says, "Damn it, I am a man just like you." So if the bus driver does stop in Batesburg, Leesville, gets off, gets the city police chief and a police person. They get Woodard and they beat him so badly that they grind his eyes out with a baton. And he comes to the next day blind. They take him to a veterans hospital. Hinton finds out. Hinton goes in search for him. It becomes a national story. Orson Welles, the actor and director, does three radio shows on this, which you can hear at archive.org. There's an immense fundraiser for him. So South Carolina is exposed, and the FBI gets involved, and they're forced to bring it to trial, but there is no effort by South Carolina to do anything but wait for the white jury, all male, to make their decision. The judge, again Waring, knows what's going to happen, and he tells his bailiff, I'm going for a walk, because he can't bear the idea that they're going to walk into the room and in 2 minutes declare Linwood Shull, the police chief, innocent. He forces them to take 15 minutes to do it. They declare him innocent, and this becomes international news. This is the children of segregation, as my friend Cecil Williams calls it. These are the people that are living in this world. This is at the same time as all these things I'm telling you about, which is 44, 45, 46, 47. This is Cecil, and this is his best friend, who is considered Black in South Carolina, whose name is Leroy Sultan. Here's some more of his friends. And so it's useful to think why, one of the reasons I show this picture, Cecil's going to grow up to be a civil rights photographer, has a wonderful book called Freedom and Justice, is because I want you to think about what do we think race is? What is race? And Orangeburg, South Carolina, where this picture is, has decided. This is the second of the upsetting pictures. This is Willie Earl. Willie Earl was a taxi driver. A white taxi driver was stabbed, and Willie Earl was not named, he was not described, but because he was an epileptic who people were uncomfortable with, probably, he was picked up, he was put in jail. The taxi drivers were upset. Mr. Brown, who is the person who has been stabbed, as I said, has not identified anybody, but the taxi drivers get a lynch mob together, this is in Greenville, kidnap or abduct, Willie Earl, take him out and murder him, leave him in a ditch, his body in a ditch, call a Black funeral home. The Black funeral home operator gets Mr. Earl's body, calls Reverend Hinton, who comes up with George Elmore, remember George Elmore, and they photograph Willie Earl's body to document this lynching. You already know how the story is going to come out. There is a trial because the FBI again gets involved, and Thurman is governor. He's not happy about the FBI being there, but he's also rather embarrassed by what he calls mob rule. Dame Rebecca West, who's been covering the Nuremberg trials, comes to South Carolina through New Yorker to write about the trial. There are 31 men arrested. The FBI is very quick about it. They all confess, they're all acquitted. They do confess, but the judge rules that no one can, they identify the people who stab him, the 31, they all agree. They identify the shooter, whose name is Ferd, but the judge rules that they can only incriminate themselves. They cannot incriminate each other, and this is one of the ways that they get off. So this is the environment in which some parents in Somerton, South Carolina, decide that they want a school bus. This is the last of the horrible pictures. This is Reverend Archie Ware, who in 1948, the lynching was 46, and then Willie was 47, this is 48. In Calhoun Falls, goes to exercise the right to vote. He is stabbed by people after he finishes voting and left for dead. He's rescued by his friends, taken to the hospital. There's some pictures at South Caroliniana showing the long cuts on his thighs down here and on his belly with dozens and dozens of stitches. These are the clothes, the bloodstained clothes that he was wearing. He leaves for Illinois. The state newspaper does a short story in which they interview the police chief in Abbeville County, who says, well, it could take 3 weeks, it could take 3 months, it could take 3 years. Reverend Ware has identified everybody who has stabbed him, but nothing's going to happen. So this is the schools I was mentioning, and this is Somerton. This is where some parents have spent the equivalent of $8,000 today, and these are sharecroppers and tenant farmers, to go from a truck that Levi Pearson is using to buying a used bus. The children call it the sunshine bus because it constantly breaks down in the rain when they really most want it. So this is a typical school for Black children, and this is another typical school for Black children. So to go back, this is Spring Hill, which is in Clarendon County, and this is Liberty Hill. And the church, Liberty Hill Church, is going to become very important in Briggs versus Elliott because of the minister there. These schools, as I've already mentioned, are donated Masonic lodges. There are hunting lodges. There are abandoned houses that are then turned into schools. The parents do the very best they can, but the children are getting water from wells. They're bringing in coal and wood for an oil drum. They're sitting on old church pews. There are no blackboards. There are no tables to write on. This is going to become an issue in the desegregation lawsuit. It's clearly horribly unequal. But this is how the schools are run, and all the school boards are run by white people. The schools themselves that are serving Black children have Black principals and Black teachers, but they have no power outside of their schoolhouse door. And this is a white school. As I said, you would recognize the white schools. This is a white graded school in the town of Somerton. This is some of the petitioners. So after Levi Pearson buys a bus, and Pearson and Hinton does his challenge, find me a minister willing to sue for a bus. Reverend Delane, who lives in Somerton, and Levi Pearson, who are friends because the children, many children of Pearson go to, some of them go to Reverend Hinton's school. They decide to sue for a bus. Now this is unheard of. They first ask for a bus and they're turned away with really inflammatory language. And so they decide to sue. And these are some of the litigants. This is Harry Briggs here, who's the Briggs versus Elliott. This is Robert Georgia. You're going to see a picture about him later. This is Cecil Williams, is now a sub-teen who is assisting a photographer named E.C. Jones with a big Graflex. These are the enormous cameras that you would see in the Civil War pictures on legs, and they have glass plates, and this holds the camera and the glass plates. And this is petitioners, potential petitioners in Liberty Hill hearing about whether they can bear up in terms of both signing a petition and funding the lawsuit, because the funding comes locally to support the NAACP and the research it would do. This is Harry Briggs Sr., and this is Eliza Briggs. So what happens is through what I think of as shady shenanigans, they discount Pearson's lawsuit because he had children. One school could be a school district. There were something like 150 some odd school districts. And so he has children in multiple school districts, and the officials come and say, you are not legitimate because the name on this petition is this child, and this child is going across this field to this school. And so Thurgood Marshall says it's not a good case. We can't argue it that way. And so the people that you saw in the previous picture, they go and demand in Columbia for Hinton to get Thurgood Marshall back down, and they say, we will sue for what they call equal everything. And what they mean by equal everything is not just school buses, but the school books, the buildings, equal everything. And so over several months, the NAACP starts collecting potential petitioners and looking at Manning and Somerton and choosing Somerton because the schools are so horrific. And the reason the petition becomes named Briggs versus Elliott, Elliott is the Somerton official. is because their NAACP tells them the church in town is St. Mark, the church you saw in the country is Liberty Hill. It's probably not safe for well over 100 people, 107 people, parents and children signed, for them to be signing in a church because it's dangerous. And so they go in small groups to Harry Briggs' home. He lives across the street and a block or two away from the church. And his family is the first to sign. As you can see, he's a veteran. He's risked his life. He's also been denied GI Bill benefits, and Reverend Delane has pushed for that. This is Robert Georgia, who I pointed out before. He signs the petition too, and we're going to talk in a few minutes about all the consequences that fall. He is a truck, what we call a truck farmer now. He harvests his crops, puts them in a wagon with his mules and goes sells them in variety towns, and they try to take his mules away. Here's Thurgood Marshall, and he's coming into Charleston in 1951 to argue for the Equal Everything lawsuit. Waring, who is clear by now is a man ahead of his time in South Carolina, says, why aren't you going for desegregation? And Marshall agrees. The NAACP has decided, because of the success of its college lawsuits, that it should not only have abandoned the bus lawsuit, but not try for equal everything, try for desegregation. And so they've been afraid about doing this because they're going to have to argue for the 14th Amendment again, which is what they've used, which promises citizenship and equal rights that cannot be abridged by states. They're worried that if they lose, then they lose everything from then on. And they've worried and worried and worried about from the 1930s, when Charles Hamilton Houston, who founded the Howard Law School and hired Thurgood Marshall, came to South Carolina to film how bad the schools were. But in July, they have decided, yeah, let's go for the whole thing. And so Marshall comes down to argue after they've done extensive research on the schools. They've brought in white and black scholars to evaluate the schools. They brought in, as you're probably familiar with, Kenneth Clark, to hold up to children a white baby doll and a black baby doll and say, point to, and talking to black children, point to the one who's the good baby, point to the one that's the smart baby, point to the one that everybody likes, and almost all the children point to the black one as the bad baby, and the white one is the good baby. I interviewed one of the young women who was doing this test. She said, we could only get white baby dolls, and we knew about the white schools. We wanted to be in the white schools. We knew about the white clothes. We knew about white books. So we knew the white baby doll must be the best baby doll. And this was mocked by the South Carolina attorneys, but it was very powerful with the Supreme Court as an argument. So here is the petitioners and their supporters. There's Eliza Briggs. Here's her son, Harry Briggs Jr. Here is Harry Briggs Sr. This is Reverend Delane. His home will be burned to the ground. His church will be burned to the ground, and he'll be run out of the state. This is Reverend Richburg, who stays on for many years, but dies very young in 1960 in his 40s, and people down there are convinced that he was poisoned. This is Reverend Seals, who also stays after Reverend Delane's run out of town. His house is burned to the ground, and he has no insurance, and his hog farm out in the country is decimated. Eliza Briggs, Maisie Solomon, and Annie Gibson are all maids at a Somerton motel. And at this point in time, this is the route to Florida. And so there's a lot of traffic through the town. They're fired at one motel, they go to another motel, they last there a week before the white owner says, I've got to fire you. It's not that I want to fire you. The city's told me they'll cut off my water if I don't fire you. And so this is the people who are going to put up with all this and not take their names off the petition. So it goes from 107, when there is such extreme response in terms of danger and violence and economic pressure, to the NAACP cutting that more than in half to people who are confirmed risk takers, I guess you would say, or heroic people that they are sure will last, because if everybody drops off the petition, you have no lawsuit. This is Mary Oliver, and she signs every petition. And in the meantime, her husband dies of a cerebral hemorrhage. They have a cafe in town where they also coach on voting rights. And one of her friends says to her, "Mary, why did you sign again?" And she says of her dead husband, "I promised him I'd be a woman." This is the Delanes' burned house. The firefighters refused to put it out. They were called to the fire and wouldn't put it out. This is what happens in 1954. South loses in court. Segregation must go. Time to mix, put off. Because as you know, the 1954 decision delayed how this was going to happen to 1955, and then just said at all deliberate speed, which South Carolina took as never. Several southern states did, but 6 or 7, including South Carolina, were the ones that lasted the longest with segregation. South Carolina didn't, we can't say fully, didn't make a true and sincere effort till 1970-71, when a federal judge said, you have no more federal money. And this was in Greenville, and then it affected the whole state. But in the meantime, there's the White Citizens Council who are doing what is called the squeeze. And the squeeze, the freeze, is where, as I mentioned before, people lose their jobs, they lose their land, they're evicted, their mortgages are called in, their mules are called in, they are not sold feed and seed, they don't have cars. These are poor people in the late 40s and early 50s. And so what happens is the NAACP and Majeska Simpkins, who is family has Victory Savings Bank in Columbia, start a fund and start collecting clothes. These are blue jeans that you're giving out, and this photograph is in Jet magazine. And start trying to assist the people who are still holding on to their petition and their hopes from 54 to 55 and 55 on, that they will get not just equal everything, but desegregation. This is a White Citizen Council meeting at the Township Auditorium. Sometimes they were called the Manicured Klux. Sometimes they were called the Ku Klux Klan in ties. And here's their Confederate flag. And I consider this as, upsetting like the pictures. This is one of their brochures. And it says, if you're bigoted and prejudiced, etc., so are George Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, illustrious forebears who believed in segregation. The fate of our great nation is in the hands of the Southerners. If we submit to this, these Supreme Court judges and their integration law, we're submitting to atheism, communism. This is language that you might be familiar with. The language you would not be familiar with is they talked about amalgamation and mongrelization. And one of the ways that white people claimed that a lynching was justified was they claimed that Black men had sexually assaulted white women. Ida B. Wells investigated all that. It was an incredibly small percentage that had anything to do with sexual assaults. There was a man, General Lee, who was lynched in South Carolina for knocking on a white woman's door. Mr. Frazier and his family in Lake City were shot, including his baby, after their house was set on fire because he was the first Black postmaster. So there's this obsession with what they call amalgamation, or here, mongrelization. The Citizens Council is the South's answer to the mongrelizers. We will not be integrated. We're proud of our white blood and our white heritage of 60 centuries. So this is a brochure, and this is the sort of language. They have a White Citizen Council newsletter, and there are within practically weeks of the White Citizens Council being founded in Mississippi, the lawyer for South Carolina, S. Emory Rogers from Somerton, is touring the state, setting up White Citizens Councils in 55. And there are 40,000 members almost immediately in this small southern state. And they're actively, as I pointed out, trying to do everything they can to ruin the lives and make Black people leave. So among those leaders, here's Strom Thurmond, who served as governor and then as a US senator until he was 100 years old. This is Senator Eastland of Mississippi. This is Mendel Rivers, who was a representative from the 30s into the 70s or 80s in Charleston. And this is Solomon Blott, who was Speaker of the House into the 70s. So Governor Burns, who's the governor at the time, is in an opera box in the Township Auditorium listening to this. I have a picture of him smiling as he listens, and he's sitting with Thurman's wife, Jean. The powers that be are completely involved with what we can only call terrorism. And what I want to point out here is I'm talking about a lot of very dark things. But when Robert Georgia was threatened, his neighbors helped him bail out his mules. When Annie Gibson and her family as sharecroppers were being tossed off their land, another Black farmer who owned a lot of land named John McDonald gave them some land, and the neighbors got together and built them a house. So there was a unification. John McDonald's daughter, many years later, in this effort to desegregate Somerton, in I think it's like 1969, 70, 71, right in that period, she becomes one of 6 Black students who do go to Somerton High School. He drives her to high school every day with a gun, not to use, but to make a point. And her books are thrown in the trash can. Her teachers confess when the Department of Justice is involved that they've been asked to fail her. She doesn't drop out of school. Her dad has encouraged her to do this because he's been there from the beginning, and she graduates. So there are these people that are making incredible efforts to back off people who just want their constitutional rights that have been promised them in word, but not in deed. So this is the Ku Klux Klan at the South Carolina State House in that was 1956. This is 1957. They formed a human cross. They marched up and down Main Street. And if you were Black and you set foot on the State House grounds, you were arrested. This starts young. These are some of the young women who are the auxiliary, the ladies of the Camellia is what they're called. And they're full members of the Ku Klux Klan. So I'm ending with this. A man was lynched by police yesterday. There's an artist named Dred Scott, D-R-E-A-D, who put up this flag at an art gallery in 2016 after Walter Scott was shot in the back in Charleston. And Dred Scott does performative kinds of art, and he had a point to make. And he said, one of his points is the past always informs the present. And that's one of the things that I hope we'll talk about that I told Holly, I think in an unnerving way, my book has become about is not only the incredible bravery of people like Reverend Hinton and their forward thinking and their willingness to sacrifice and their persistence, but also that there must be persistence now because it's certainly not over, is it, this effort? And there is such inspiration in the people in this book who, as I said, get up in the morning and know it might cost them their lives, but they're going to make the world a better place. And they did. I think it's wrong to say we haven't made progress. We have, thanks to people like them, just not enough. So let me say that the book is worth reading because it's their stories. USC Press has published it, but it's at Barnes & Noble. It's at Amazon. You can go to bookshop.org and get it from your favorite independent bookstore. I have a website called storiesofstruggle.com that I'm constantly building on so that, there's free access to a lot of this information. And I use a lot more of the pictures there too. And my goal really is pretty simple. I want you to know these people, and I want you to think about what you can do. And one of the lessons I learned from the sit-ins was that everybody has a role. The students figured this out. Not everybody can sit at the lunch counter and get shoved off a counter seat. You can be the one who paints the signs. That's still important, the picket signs. You can be the one that scouts. You can be the one that writes the talks. You can be the one that has the food when you go back to the church, that there's so many roles to play. The one I've chosen to play besides writing is mentoring children. And, you know, one by one, you get kids through school, you get them that education, and they can be game changers too. So that's my pictures, a little about my book, a little about Briggs versus Elliott, and now I hope to hear from you.
Wow, thank you. A lot of this I knew, but most of it I did not, and you just filled in some real gaps. What kind of questions do people have? Taba.
Thank you so much. It was powerful the way you described it with the pictures. Do you, I guess in your research, did you find any reason why we're not taught these more in our schools? Is it to disconnect the current generation from realizing how much of a history of activism South Carolina has? Is it like to take away some of that hope of this rich history, or is it like that was the only thing I could think of, is like, why would we not be taught these this powerful history?
Until the late 1970s, the South Carolina history book had been written in the late 1800s by William Gilmore Simms, and then his daughter, Simms Oliphant, slightly revised it. And that history book, there are probably people living who are here at this meeting who have read this history book, praised the KKK. They were noble men trying to thwart the thugs, you know, would be the language of today. The language she used was even way more offensive. And if we jump ahead to right now, we now have 7 states that are saying, are passing legislation saying it's unpatriotic to write about or provide information to students about the Trail of Tears with Native Americans, or about the Tulsa massacre, or the internment of the Japanese. That this is unpatriotic and is inappropriate history. So I think, you know, the short answer would be that there's still some of the same people in power, and they're making sure they stay in power by limiting information. And there's one way to keep power, isn't it? Is to keep people ignorant and uneducated and uninformed, all of those. So I do think of it as deliberate. There's a good history book by Howard Zinn, who was actually involved with the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That's sort of the history that you weren't taught. And there's a book by James Lowen that's also about that. He writes about things like sundown towns, where you had to, if you were a person of color, you had to be out of town before it was dark. So there are people out there, you know, who are knocking on the door of truth. But one of the powers of Texas is it's such a big state that it controls textbook adoption. Whatever, because there are so many thousands of books bought by Texas, those books that are adopted are often adopted by other states or become the predominant book that's available to public schools and adopted by public schools. So Texas is one of the states that's passed what I would think of as a memory police law or a censorship law that's going to affect kids going back to school this fall. What do you think? Do you think that's the reason? Power and control?
Definitely. I think the way you explain it, you're right. It is power and control, and a little bit of like, if you don't, a lot of our history is our power. A lot of our history, realizing that that it is a long struggle, and that people have done this before and they've succeeded even incrementally. I think you pointed out that you know, we've come a long way, we've done a lot. So I think maybe that might be part of it as well. Is like, if you make people forget that somebody has been through this struggle in one way or the other before and succeeded, then you feel overwhelmed, like you have to start all over. So maybe that might be part of it too.
Yeah, and it feeds into, I don't quite know how to say this, but a lot of white people say, well, I suffered too, it's hard for me too. And so it's good that we have the language of that we're developing now, like white privilege. But one of the consequences of suppressing these stories is you don't know how incredibly people suffered and persevered, kept on keeping on. So it could be easy for you to think, oh, my suffering was terrible. I had to walk 6 blocks to the school bus, not knowing that someone was walking 9 miles with no school bus. So there is a sort of a pretentiousness that happens with that limited view of history, where you pat yourself on the back because you just really don't understand the breadth and depth of the suffering that people have gone through.
And how many people work together, like you're writing the books now. A lot of people did work together in the past, that allyship.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
At the same time, I moved into the state in 2002. And early on, there was a program that I attended, and I'm trying to think who put it on. Natural History Museum, I'm not sure. But there was a gentleman there who spoke, and he said, we did hear the story about the school bus. They told us that story, that real story. And they had people there who were part of the people who were the ones who stood tall for justice and for some of the rights for their children, the needs of their children. But there was another gentleman there that they introduced, and he was an older gentleman. He had just within the last couple of years before that, so right around the turn of the century, been able to return to South Carolina. He had fled for his life because he had stood up for some of these things. And he was threatened with arrest, and he knew he would be killed. Literally, they would find ways to, quotes, justify, unquotes, a crime against him. And he had been warned by people in this town that he lived in for what he was doing, for standing up for his people and the children. And he was helped to get out of not just his town, but get out of South Carolina. And he had only recently come back. So many people really live this. I think that was my wake up when I came. I met so many wonderful people here. I also heard some of this and saw that people were working to come over it. I was so glad he was finally back, but he'd only been back 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, Reverend Delane, I think I mentioned he was run out of town. He was also run out of the state. In Lake City, they started shooting into his home, and he couldn't get the police involved. And after his church was burned down, and they were back, and it was called Operation Shoot 'em Up. The goal was to either murder or persuade Reverend Delane and his wife to leave. He told the sheriff he was going to shoot to mark the car because he'd already given them the license plate number and they hadn't done anything. So he shot to mark the car, and then he got in his car. He was chased 90 miles per hour. They gave up, the guys who pursued them. And then he kept on going, made it to New York City, and the very powerful bishop there, Bishop D. Ward Nichols in Harlem, took him in, and Governor Averell Harriman refused to extradite him when South Carolina tried to extradite him, ignoring everything that had gone on before and saying that he was the criminal who had shot the car. Now, nobody was hurt in the car. It was the car that was shot, not the people. And so he never did come back to South Carolina. His sons, he moved to Charlotte, where 2 of his sons worked as educators. And he was always threatening to cross the border. And because the warrant was still alive, they kept saying, "Dad, you can't." And he died without coming back home. The Briggses, Harry Briggs went to Florida to work while Mrs. Briggs stayed. The children received death threats. And they eventually went to New York, seeking help and a reunion with Reverend Delane. And Reverend Delane wrote the NAACP to say, "What are you doing? You're ignoring these great heroes. They're practically starving." And Walter White, who was the president of NAACP at that point in time, went and was so unnerved by their plight that he wrote a check to buy them winter coats He started looking for jobs for them. And Nathaniel Briggs, the youngest son, has kept the family home, and he comes back down. But for a lot of the petitioners, like the Briggs, at some point they ultimately did have to leave the state and didn't come back. And so when you think about that phrase brain drain, Sister Nancy, when you think about that, you know, like this gentleman you've mentioned, who could have probably been a wonderful South Carolina citizen, you know, that we would have benefited by, have gone off to give their benefits to other places because of the mistreatment and danger in South Carolina. And I should
Thank you for
mention that
telling their
Reverend Delane,
stories. We need to hear their stories so that we ourselves can grow and be a part of the future of what we believe. Thank you.
oh, you're welcome.
This is Kay. My grandfather was D. Ward Nichols.
Oh,
So I'm very, very familiar with Reverend Delane. He stayed with our family. I wasn't born. I'm very, very young, of course.
yeah,
So I was not born, but he stayed. He lived with us for a year.
Yeah.
We're my family. He became the pastor of a church in Buffalo, which is still in existence, called Delane Waring.
yeah.
Children, my grandfather was a bishop, and gave him a job. So this is excellent hearing, because it's great hearing the real story as opposed to the family around the table story.
Yeah.
And it's true that it matches. I had heard he hid in a coffin. Did your research?
They did. The whole family told different stories, and I understand from what they told me, this was on purpose. Nobody was going to tell the real story because nobody wanted anybody in trouble. So in one story, he gets to Florence, where there's a relative, and the relative smuggles him to an airport, and he flies to Washington, and then a relative picks him up to New York. In another story, he abandons his car, calls his brother-in-law, says the car's in Florence, and gets in a truck with a white truck driver and goes to, so and his wife, there's a Moving Image Research Center has some oral histories by Grace McFadden, who was in African-American studies and did some early oral histories. And his wife tells another story too. And so I just included them. I said, there's this, and Jet Magazine tells a great story that sort of like puts several of these things in. So somehow he made it to New York and to the bishop's house, yeah, as you know.
Yeah, I knew this stuff about, but it was really great. And a couple weeks ago, I recommend this for everybody to see the Legacy Museum, which you referred to, which is the, called colloquially the Lynching Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. It is very, very, very powerful, and I recommend it for everybody. And I mean, I can't wait to buy multiple copies of your books. And just, was Reverend Hinton, was he an AME pastor too?
He was Baptist.
So it's good working together. That's excellent.
Yeah, well, I have a minister who's Presbyterian, who has a section before the 1960 sit-ins. Everybody had the same goal, right? And so they really could work with each other. This Reverend Cecil Gustus Ivey, he's Presbyterian, and he's an NAACP president, but the Congress of Racial Equality is represented by James T. McCain, and the NAACP by Reverend Newman, and they're not enemies, but they're competitive with the students. He gets them all working together, and he did a bus strike in '57 that was far more successful in its own small way than the Montgomery bus boycott, because it becomes a permanent bus service for the Black residents of Rock Hill. And he gets everybody talking. He gets everybody talking and cooperating, and he ends up with something like 5 or 6 buses from all the different churches participating because they get their name on the bus. And so there's a great flip where instead of Black people being abused by the white bus drivers on the white-owned bus service, there's only a Black bus service because they put the white bus service out of business. And so he's another example of this cooperation that happened. And then there were some, I should mention, because this would probably be of interest to you, is partners. There were a couple of groups, for example, one in Rock Hill, that were interfaith ministers, white and black, working together, and the community relations council that, for example, employed the core field secretary, Mr. McCain. So there were some biracial, multi-religion groups in some towns that were trying to make a difference, but it was very difficult. Sometimes the ministers were fired.
It was only for women too. I mean, for men.
Yes. Yeah.
The one here, that is.
Yeah.
Adrian has mentioned a book that I put in the chat box, J. Russell Hawkins, The Bible Told Them So, How Southern Evangelicals Fought to Preserve White Supremacy, and he focused. Oh yes, Adrian, I just read an interview with him a few days ago. It was in the Religion News Service. This person started out to look at the entire South, and he ended up focusing on South Carolina. Has anybody else read that yet? I think it must be brand new. I feel like we could probably talk for a lot longer, but given the hour, I feel I need to begin to wrap us up. Adrian, would you like to share anything on behalf of IPSC?
Well, thanks, Holly. Not in terms of events or programming so much, but obviously an appreciation for Claudia, and the storytelling that you brought forth tonight is just incredible. New lenses to see these important topics. And IPSC has just begun a really, hopefully a fruitful relationship with the International African American Museum in Charleston. And they have a faith-based programming pillar, really, of operations, and that's already begun. They've already begun their work, even though the museum hasn't opened yet. And again, it's about storytelling. So I think we're moving in a good direction to connect with their faith-based programming to see how we can learn more. But again, thanks to Claudia.
Yeah. Thank you.
I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. I just opened my mouth to mention the August program, and I can't remember what it is.
Gotcha. I got you covered.
It's yours. Thank you,
yeah.
Roger.
Kay and I have been working with Sarah and Cheryl. The title is Honoring Our Elders. The subtitle is How Communities of Faith and Conscience Uplift the Elderly. And we'll be getting some folks to come along with us on this talk that I think will be very, very valuable. We'll be probably inquiring some of y'all in your different faiths even prior to that, just to kind of make sure we've got a good representation. But please book that time for August 3rd, 7 o'clock. And we really, really look forward to that opportunity to discuss our elderly and how the faith communities and the conscious communities are engaged.
Hey, thank you. And as always, the first Tuesday of the month, right now while we're still online, 7 o'clock, and we're playing it safe. Plus, we don't have a restaurant to go to. But even when we do decide to go back to having some dinner meetings, our little group has decided that we would like to continue to offer these Zoom meetings, because people like Shelley get to rejoin us. And we've had people actually from a number of states at some of our events. So Claudia, again, this was fantastic. And we just are so grateful for not just for you sharing with us tonight, but for doing this work. This is so important, and I'm very grateful.
And I'd say another person was Paul Palmer. Another thank you to Claudia. She spoke on her book. This is the second time I had her do a little dog and pony show, so to speak, on her book. But I heard her first with St. Martin's in the Fields, and when I heard they were going to do this tonight, well, I decided I'd make sure I had some time to go do this today, and I appreciate that. And of course, her buddy, working buddy from the Ancient of Days at the newspaper, Allison Askins, is we're grateful to Claudia doing this, and So some of the stuff that Claudia was said tonight that I forgot from the last time, I picked it up again. So maybe a little bit more of it's kind of stuck in my head. This
Well,
story of
thank you for being back. Let me mention that I would be delighted to do book clubs or other organizations you have, because again, I want people to know the stories, and I do tailor. I have lots of different angles and lots of different heroes here to talk about. And so if you have a special interest, I would be delighted to talk to your group, your friends, whatever, and get the
yes,
word out.
and what
Thank
she
you for
talked
coming
about
back.
today wasn't a carbon copy of what I heard at St. Martin's. It was close, but it wasn't quite. It was about a third of it was stuff that was a little different.
Yeah, I'm Briggs versus Elliott's kind of my favorite because of what's going on right now and how I can pull Reverend Hinton in. But I would like more opportunities to talk about the hospital strike and those 400 women.
Yes.
Whoa. And then, of course, the students. When I talk to youth groups, I try to focus on nonviolent direct action and talk about the sit-ins and how you can, as a young person, be nonviolent and change the world.
Would you consider talking to the Clarendon County Council on Aging?
I'd be thrilled.
I think we can make that happen.
Cool.
Claudia, one question. Are you able to present and do these kind of talks and feedback with the college population and the high school population?
I have one USC class so far that's adopted the book, and I've done a talk at Spring Hill High School in Lexington before at the end of the school year, and with a graduate class at Columbia College. I've done, the book came out right before Christmas, so there's Christmas. So I've done about 40 Zooms, and I really would like to do more with young people, particularly because of the nonviolent aspect. It's just wonderful to have Zoom and be able to reach people so easily and not have to get on an airplane, for example.
Claudia, before we go, you want to remind us again how people can reach you?
Yeah, if you go to the website storiesofstruggle.com, you can find me that way, and you can also see some of the other events I have done if you're interested in listening to me again. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of archival photos, so you can just click there and get to an email to reach me, and then Holly knows how to track me down too, and I would be just thrilled to hear from you. And if you want to use my home email, it's just my name, claudiasbrinson@gmail.com.
Okay. Thank you again. Thank you, everybody. Be safe. Have a great July. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Claudia. Thank you. Thank you.